Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, forging a hunting knife. Today's project is kind of vaguely inspired by the famous Randall type hunting knives. We're not attempting to make a Randall knife, it's just kind of in that general vein. The knife's going to be forged, and we're going to be using a Damascus steel handle guard, which actually was made in a previous project. We'll have a link to that here in the description and the cards and so forth if you want to check that one out. So we're going to make everything but the guard. I always enjoy making forged knife projects. Forging is really what got me started in this business. Most of the knives that I make now are stock removal, but it's always great to get out there with the fire and the hammer. So let's jump right on in. Today's project is undoubtedly one of the most complicated builds I've shown, but there's a lot of interesting stuff here and a lot of interesting build technique. So I'm going to really drill down into the gory details on this one. I'll be forging this blade from a piece of 1095 high carbon steel. There are a lot of very complex techniques and tools used in this particular project. These just happen to be the ones I used based on my tools and my skill set, and frankly my whims as I was making up the knife. Because the project's pretty complicated, this video will be split into a couple of chunks, one appearing today and one coming out a couple days from now. I begin by tapering the blade, building in preformed tapers. Now this is really important when forging knives. If you just plow right in without forging in the rough tapers of the knife, you'll tend to get something really goofy looking when you forge the bevels in. So once I've got those tapers all squared away, I'll turn to the bevels. Bevels being the slopey, cutty part of the knife, the things that separate a knife from a crowbar. I'm forging alternately on one side, then the other. If you don't, the blade will corkscrew. Not only that, but in a blade like this, the edge will also be off-center. The big trick when forging Western-style blades like this is you don't ever want the ricasso, that's the part of the blade that's next to the tang, to touch the anvil when you're beveling. If you do, you'll squash the ricasso, drive the cutting edge off center, and generally just totally screw the pooch. So, when you get close, you have to be very careful to hang the stock off the edge and not hit the ricasso with the hammer. Once I'm happy with the overall shape of the blade, I'll free it from the bar stock on my cutoff hardy, then flip it around and draw out the tang. Forged knives almost invariably have hidden tangs, so the width of the tang is less than the width of the rest of the blade. Once again, we're in perilous territory. One wrong hammer blow can drive the tang off center or even crush the ricasso, so a lot of care is required at this point. And that's that. I'll finish by normalizing the blade 3 times, that is, heating it to around 1600 degrees, then letting it cool to black. This refines the grain, making it more shock resistant and changing its heat treating characteristics just a little bit. When you hear Smith saying something like refining the grain, it can sound like BS or voodoo, but it's really not in this case. What it means is that each time the blade passes through the austenite transformation, new grains of steel form on the boundaries of old grains, causing an increase in the number of grains and a corresponding decrease in the size of those grains. The larger the grains are in a piece of steel, the more brittle it is at any given hardness. Small grains equal a blade that can be whacked on with less likelihood of cracking. So now it's off to the grinder to start shaping the blade. First, I'll reduce the thickness of the blade a little, cleaning off the scale and pitting that occurs anytime you forge a blade, and flattening the blade while I'm at it. Once I've gotten it fairly flat, I'll take it to my surface grinder and really flatten it big time. You can do this by hand, on sandpaper, or with a belt grinder, but if you really want something flat, nothing beats a surface grinder. I have to flip it a few times to compensate for the unevenness of the forged blank, but eventually we get there. Now I'll clean up the lines of the knife and grind in the bevels. One of the key features on this knife is that it'll have a Damascus steel guard. I'm not going to show the making of the guard in this video. In fact, I've got a whole separate video that I put out a couple weeks ago where I show the making of that guard. Link in the cards and the description. But here's a quick overview. Okay, seriously though. In order to seat the guard cleanly against the ricasso, with no visible gaps between the guard and the blade, I'll need to cut clean, even corners at the point where the tang meets the blade. This can be done by hand using a $10 file guide if you want. I've got a video showing how to make one of those too if you're interested, but I'll be using a mill. I've mounted the blade here in a toolmaker's vise. The cool thing about toolmaker's vices is that all of the faces of the vise have been ground square. This means that you can mill one side of the blade, then flip the vise over, and when you mill the little shelf on the other side of the blade, it will be absolutely dead square and level with the other side. Then flip the vise over, and when you mill the little shoulder on the other side of the blade, it'll be dead square and level with the other side. You'll see why this is important later. So now all the preliminary shaping of the blade's done, and we're ready for heat treating. I'll heat the blade in my forge to about 1500 Fahrenheit, more or less cherry red, then quench it in Parks 50, a fast quenching oil specifically engineered for high carbon steel, which has to be cooled very quickly in order to harden properly. After testing with a file to make sure the quench was successful, I'll temper the blade twice at 400 Fahrenheit for an hour each cycle, softening the steel so it's not too brittle. After tempering, I'll give the blade one quick pass on the surface grinder to remove scale and burned oil from the blade. Then it's time to fit the guard. If you've ever seen handmade knives at a knife show or online and wondered why they're so darn expensive, this section will answer your question. High-quality handmade knives involve a ridiculous amount of hand fitting, and the difference between pretty good, which is what this knife is, and perfect is a lot of skill, a lot of practice, and an absurd amount of really anal fussing around. Now, as far as the procedure I'm using here goes, I'm not going to tell you this is the right way or the perfect way or the way the cool kids do it, but it's a way, and it worked for me here. A slot has been milled in the guard, but that slot was intentionally made undersized so that I could hand fit it to the final blade. Now, there are many ways of achieving a tight fit on this general type of knife, some undoubtedly better than the one I use here. The standard these days on this kind of knife is a virtually invisible joint. Whatever the approach you take, the basic idea is that you have to start undersized and then just sneak up on that final dimension. In this case, that means filing, checking, rinse and repeat. I would bet I literally repeated this process 100 times before I got to the nice tight press fit I was aiming for. Some details to note. I did some filing here with a big file, but 95% of the work was done with tiny little hobby files. Also notice that all the files have a safe edge ground on one side of the file. This allows you to restrict your filing to only one surface when working in corners, so that you don't accidentally move other surfaces at the same time. It also allows you to cut extremely crisp corners. Now, this all kind of sounds a little silly, but a gap or a wobbly spot in a line, and we're talking here just maybe 1/1000th of an inch, is painfully obvious on a knife like this. As I said at the top of the video, this isn't my standard type of knife, so I'm sure I'd go a little quicker if I did this every day. But I spent probably 4, maybe even 5 hours just fitting this guard. Some other points. It may not be easy to see, but once I get close to the final fit, I'm doing all of my filing with the file canted just a hair down toward the inside of the guard so that there's a barely perceptible slope in that guard mouth. If I don't do that, it's possible to basically dig a hole in the external face of the guard slot that would cause a visible inconsistency in the line. Literally one single file stroke at a critical point in the process could cause you to scrap the guard entirely. So given that I've probably got 15 hours of work just in the guard, I really insert your favorite curse word here, do not want this to happen. So once I'm getting close, it's 2 or 3 strokes of the file max, check the fit, then 2 or 3 strokes of the file again, check again, over and over and over. Anyway, eventually I got a pretty good hairline fit. And with that, we're going to pause here. In the next video, we'll take up where we left off, finishing the handle and guard, and doing the final assembly of the knife. Look for that video in a couple of days. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.